Chapter 3 Preparations for Vertical Descent. We soon reached the main railway station. We traveled by train, then steamer, then by small boat until we reached Copenhagen. Finally, we arrived at the Phoenix Hotel in Bredegate. Then we went to the Museum of Northern Antiquities. My uncle had a letter of introduction to the curator of this establishment. He was a friend of the Danish consul at Hamburg, Professor Thomsen. We were welcomed cordially. Needless to say, we kept the real reason for our trip a secret. Professor Thomsen placed himself at our disposal, and we visited the docks in order to find the next vessel to sail. I still hoped there would be no way of getting to Iceland, but there was no such luck. A small Danish boat, the Valkyria, was set to sail for Reykjavik on the 2nd of June. After the arrangements were made for our passage, we took a tour of the city. But my uncle was only interested in a certain church spire. He insisted we go to the top, more for my benefit than his. He wanted us to be prepared for the awesome heights and depths that we've encountered on our journey. At the top, the air made me dizzy. I felt the spire rocking with every gust of wind. My knees began to fail. Soon I was crawling, then creeping on my stomach. I closed my eyes. I seemed to be lost in space. At last I reached the apex, with my uncle dragging me up by the collar. "Look down!" he cried. I opened my eyes. My first lesson in dizziness lasted an hour. "Tomorrow we will do it again," said my uncle. And we did for 5 days in a row. The day prior to our departure, Professor Thomsen brought us letters of introduction to Mr. Finson, mayor of Reykjavik, and Mr. Fredrickson, a professor. My uncle expressed his gratitude with a hearty handshake. On June 2nd, at 6 in the evening, all of our baggage was safely on board the Valkyria. The captain took us into a very narrow cabin. We began to sail, and in a few days encountered the great Atlantic swell. When we dropped anchor before Reykjavik, in Faxa Bay, my uncle was enthusiastic. He dragged me forward and pointed north of the bay to a distant mountain with a double peak, which was covered with snow. He cried, "Snaefell!" My uncle was courteously received by the mayor, Mr. Finson. Mr. Fredrickson, professor of natural sciences at the School of Reykjavik, was a delightful man as well. Mr. Fredrickson, the modest philosopher with whom we lodged, spoke only Danish and Latin. In fact, he was the only person in Iceland with whom I could converse at all. This good-natured gentleman let us use 2 of the 3 rooms in his house. "Well, Alex," my uncle said, "now that we are here, I'm going to the library. Perhaps there is some manuscript of Saknussemm's there." Professor Liedenbrock was unusually quiet at dinner. He spoke to me with his eyes as a reminder to keep silent about our plans. Mr. Fredrickson wanted to know if my uncle enjoyed his visit to the library and whether he had found what he was looking for. My uncle complained that the shelves were nearly empty. There was not a single text of the works of Arne Saknussemm. Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy. His books were burned in 1573, Mr. Fredrickson explained. "Now it is all clear," said my uncle. "I see why he had to use a confusing puzzle to hide the secret." "What secret?" asked Mr. Fredrickson. "Have you some private document in your possession?" "No, I was only imagining," my uncle replied. "Oh, very well," answered Mr. Fredrickson, who was kind enough to change the subject. "I hope you will not leave our island until you have seen some of its mineralogical wealth." "Certainly," replied my uncle, "but surely all has been explored." "I assure you, Professor, there is plenty left to discover. That mountain in the horizon is Snaefell, and is worthy of your time." "Ah," said my uncle, as coolly as he could, "is that Snaefell?" "Yes, it's one of the most curious volcanoes. Its crater has scarcely ever been visited." "Well," replied my uncle enthusiastically, "that is where I will begin my studies. There, on that what do you call it?" "Snaefell," replied Mr. Fredrickson. "I am very sorry that I can't go with you," he added. "Oh, no, no," replied my uncle. "I thank you with all my heart, for the company of such a talented man would have been welcomed. But the duties of your post at the university must come first." I was glad Mr. Fredrickson didn't see through my uncle's transparent remarks. "Snaefell is a very good choice, Professor, but you will need a guide to take you there. I have one to offer you. He is an inhabitant of that peninsula and is a hunter. He's very clever. He speaks Danish perfectly. You can see him tomorrow. Tomorrow, then, added my uncle with a sigh. He was happy to have learned the history of Sagnusum, the reason for the mysterious document, and that our host would not accompany us on the expedition.